free my people now. Every United States citizen is entitled to 100% of compensation in any form, from anybody or organization without the taking of one dime from anyone. Compensation is from one or many to make another, or many, whole. In any amount, and for whatever reason. Compensation is not an enrichment scheme. There is no profit or gain, only an even, agreed to, exchange. Compensation, in any form, is legally acquired property. You have a God-given and protected right to acquire, own, possess, and protect property. It is morally bankrupt to tax, or encumber in any way, the free exercise of the right. The 16th Amendment did not alter the taxation clauses of the U.S. Constitution with the exception of income derived from a source, property you own or legally control. Direct taxes are still, by decree, levied among the states. Nothing has altered that pillar of freedom, except government misapplication. To the point that a $4 billion windfall and subsequent interest are not taxable income for the state. The Supreme Court has ruled that the amendment's sole purpose was to specifically prevent a direct tax on incomes from becoming a direct tax on the property itself, the source, from which an income may be derived. The Supreme Court has also ruled that an increase in the value of property or a gain accruing to capital are not income. Income is derived from capital or labor, or both combined. Income is derived from property. The inherent confusion was compounded in 1932, when by an act of Congress, the President and all judges' compensations were now considered as income. An individual and a group who were specifically protected from their compensation ever being diminished. Matters were further complicated in 1935 with Social Security. Lower courts had ruled that a direct tax in order to receive a benefit that you may or may not receive for 50 years on is permissible. Of course, the matching half paid by your employer is paid by either passing the cost on to their customers or, and more likely, by offering and paying you almost 8% less than they could have otherwise paid. A corporation does not have profit or gain until all of the bills are paid, and its overhead is completely covered. The old adage, corporations do not pay taxes, you do, is by design, and will always be true. Every dime of overhead is passed on to the consumers of goods and services or written off. Presently for an individual, your bills, expenses, and overhead are immaterial and of no concern. In 1939, Congress gave its consent to allow everyone who works for the government to surrender a portion of their agreed compensation, and from here forward, your compensation will be considered as income. Although most lawyers and officers of corporations are not paid with taxpayer funds, they all owe their professional existence to the state, and are therefore subject to the 1939 Public Salary Tax Act. In 1942, Congress enacted the Victory Tax and subjected everyone's compensation as income. Government sold it in 1943 with Donald Duck. Taxes, to beat the Axis. Compliance skyrocketed. The only confiscatory and punitive direct tax to have been levied against the average citizen since 1894 was repealed 2 years later in May of 1944. In 1945, the Bureau of Internal Revenue decided it was business as usual and continued to send tax forms. Voluntary compliance is born. A tariff is a tax used to regulate foreign commerce. It has no other purpose. All three iterations of income tax law, 1861, 1894, and 1913, have all come from tariff bills. Property taxes are as implemented, abhorrent, and a clear civil rights violation. The Indiana Constitution states, no person's property shall be taken by law without just compensation. Then, in a later section proclaims, the General Assembly shall provide, by law, for a uniform and equal rate of property assessment and taxation. After the supreme law of the land held that all duties, imposts and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. An individual working for nothing other than compensation and acquiring property domestically for personal use is not directly subject to duties, imposts and excises. There are of course exceptions, if you choose to involve yourself in any activity where an indirect tax is applicable, but the free acquisition of property by a free people is not an exception. It's our core fundamental founding principles, and it's the law. We, the free people of the United States, gave government two means to take personal property from citizens. To apply for and execute a duly sworn and signed warrant, or pay for it. Now, more than 1 million times a year, kids in cubicles seize personal property every day, with nothing more than a note. A bank or employer will roll without hesitation. Today your compensation is diminished by 50 to 60% before 1 dime of lawful tax is applied, or you are paid. Depending on where you live, if you work for 50 years, effectively, 25 years of that was with zero compensation. That is the direct taking of your labor, blood, sweat, tears, energy, talent, resources, effort and time. there is language that answers this description. You can live, work and travel anywhere you want. You can associate and contract with anyone you wish. You're free to speak your mind, and you're not in prison, but there is more to freedom. If what you take away from this is, if it's coming in, it's income. Sorry to have wasted your time, but let me ask, other than government, how many employers can you name who overall pay their employees more than they're worth? If you don't understand any of this, with all due respect, this is as succinct as I can express the matter in one sentence. Unless you are one of the 40 million people subject to the 1939 Public Salary Tax Act, to which you agreed to its terms before you were hired, or are one of 30 million foreign nationals residing and working in this country legally or illegally, then your compensation for services is not taxable and is in fact property you have a God-given and protected right to acquire, from which you may choose to risk and invest in any venture to hopefully produce income, which may be taxable, period. When people say there is no law, this is in part what they are trying to convey. FreeMyPeopleNow.com
Desas bien, e Morleo Brandetti, Production.